This video is about water and how water is essential to life. So life on the planet Earth as we know it would not be possible without the presence of liquid water. And if you think about it, if you think about scientists, researchers trying to look for life on other planets, they always start with looking at a planet that has liquid water. And the reason for that is we're going to learn about the characteristics of water. There's a lot about water that makes it conducive to life being able to originate. And if you think about the mixing of molecules at some level that would have to happen in order to even create the fundamentals of a basic organism, there needs to be some sort of medium in which that can easily happen. And water, just again, because of the characteristics of it, is very conducive to those types of things. And so in this video, we're going to look at the characteristics of water and why it is essential to life. So the 5 characteristics that we will be looking at are cohesion and adhesion, the fact that water dissolves substances, water allows for temperature regulation, water expands when it's frozen, it's actually less dense when it's frozen than it is as a liquid, and it is also involved in chemical reactions, serving as both a product and a reactant. Let's start with cohesion and adhesion. So in one of the last videos, we were looking at polar molecules, and we specifically looked at water. And remember, we talked about the fact that oxygen is very electronegative, so it pulls the electrons really strongly towards itself and creates a partial negative pull on one end of the water molecule. And the hydrogens with their weak hold then become slightly positive because one of each of those hydrogens electrons is pulled slightly away from it, leaving the charge of the proton to kind of overwhelm the charge of the electron. So basically what this does is it creates the scenario where all those hydrogen bonds can form, and this makes water molecules stick together. So you have a whole bunch of polar water molecules, individual molecules, because they have partial positive and negative ends, they're going to orient themselves and actually form sort of loose electrostatic charges, sort of similar to like a very weak ionic bond. What this does is it allows water to have a very high surface tension due to cohesion. So you've probably seen like insects walking across the surface of a water. That's because the water sticks to itself. So it's actually kind of pulling down a little bit. If you think about in your science classes, you probably had to read a graduated cylinder, and you remember there was that meniscus, that little curve. And a couple things are causing that curve. Part of it is cohesion. The water's pulling down towards itself. Part of it's adhesion. Water tends to form hydrogen bonds with other substances, which makes it stick to other substances. So the water sticks to the outside of the graduated cylinder, but it also is sticking to itself and pulling itself down. And this creates sort of a barrier between the air on the surface, the environment, and the water, which is below it. And it allows something that is lightweight to be able to actually walk on the water. Or if there's enough buoyancy, something can actually kind of float. So adhesion, another place that we see that is capillary action. So trees, when you water a plant, that water is not just sort of it's not getting sucked up by the plant. It's actually using capillary action to crawl through tiny tubules. So as the water molecules adhere to the inside of the tubule, one molecule will adhere, another will adhere, another will adhere, and eventually it kind of works its way up through the plant. The second characteristic of water that is so important is that water can dissolve so many substances. So it's a solvent. We call it the universal solvent because many solutes actually dissolve in water and form a solution. So if I put salt in water, those hydrogen bonds are going to kind of break apart the bonds between the sodium and the chloride, which are ionic bonds. And by pushing those apart, the salt actually kind of falls apart. It loses its structure. So then you end up with just individual sodium chlorides submerged in a sea of water molecules. So water dissolving things, water's hydrophilic, or substances are hydrophilic if they are polar. So they're means they're water loving. And these will be substances that do dissolve in water. So sodium chloride is polar because it has a positive side and a negative side. So it will dissolve. If something is hydrophobic or nonpolar, they don't move, or they don't dissolve in water because they are sticking to themselves. The water molecules will move away from those nonpolar ones because the water molecules are attractive, remember, to themselves because they're polar. So anything that's nonpolar will be kind of pushed into its own group. So they move away from the water and move away from its charge. The third characteristic of water is that it regulates temperature. has a high specific heat capacity. This is another characteristic you will have explored in your lab that you have done this week. So, oceans help regulate the Earth's temperature because it takes a lot of heat, which is what we call specific heat capacity. It takes a lot of heat to raise a, a gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. So because it takes so much energy to do that, water will tend to maintain its temperature really well. Because of that, as the sun is shining on the earth and the oceans, heat is being absorbed very slowly into that water, but it's also released very slowly. So water doesn't evaporate super easily, and that kind of is going to help it to with its regulatory properties. But because there is some evaporation, sweat leads to evaporative cooling. So if you think about when you're sweating, because water tends to hold on to its own heat, as the water molecules are pulled from your body, they take heat with them, and that's why you feel cooler when you sweat. Water is less dense as a solid, or less dense when it's frozen, than it is when it is in a liquid form. So when water is a liquid, because of those hydrogen bonds, remember it's attracted to itself. Those molecules get really close together. Water expands when it freezes, which allows it to float. And that's because it's kind of taking on a crystalline structure, and that gives some space between the molecules as it kind of builds that crystalline lattice. So, because water floats, that's really important to the earth because it allows organisms that live in the water to be protected when it is extremely cold outside. So, a layer of ice on the surface of a pond or a lake will hold the heat into the water. Basically, it acts as an insulator on the top, and so the organisms that live beneath will not freeze. The water won't freeze all the way down through the column and allows some organisms to survive. Some organisms produce sort of a natural antifreeze. This is just a little bit of trivia. So, like a cow, for example, its hoof doesn't freeze because it has a natural antifreeze that mixes with the fluids that are in its hoof. There's a lot of fluid in a cow's hoof, and if it wasn't for the antifreeze, it would actually freeze. Finally, water plays an important role in chemical reactions. So, I've listed two specific ones here that are very important: photosynthesis. In photosynthesis, a water molecule is used along with a carbon dioxide molecule to produce glucose. So water plays a very important role as a reactant. It is reacting with the carbon dioxide in that particular reaction. And the glucose then is the sugar molecule that can be used to produce ATP. Cellular respiration is the process that produces ATP. And in cellular respiration, instead of water being a reactant, water is a product. So in cellular respiration, water and carbon dioxide are released. So think about your cells doing work in your body. They are using a glucose molecule, and that glucose molecule is broken down. You breathe out carbon dioxide as a waste product, and you also release water that can then be uptaken throughout the body. It can be released as sweat. So it just depends where water is needed at that particular time. And those are characteristics of water, and hope this helps.